It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
This month is Mental Health Awareness Month, and in the last couple of weeks, I've spent some time in a book that really tells us a lot about mental illness, mental health, and the challenges associated with being a parent when you're raising kids who, when you've got your own mental health challenges, and sometimes they do as well. The book is by Spargo-Ryan. It's called A Kind of Magic, a memoir about anxiety, our minds, and optimism in spite of it all. It's confronting. Sometimes it's hard to read. Definitely a powerful book and a really overall optimistic, hopeful kind of book. Spargo-Ryan is the author of 2 novels and an acclaimed non-fiction writer and teacher. She's also the inaugural winner of the Horn Prize and the author of A Kind of Magic, a memoir about anxiety, our minds, optimism, and life. Spargo-Ryan, welcome to the Happy Families podcast. It's really nice to be able to spend some time with you to talk about the book.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
You start off with this tricky balance in the opening pages of this memoir. You go to see a psychologist and you've got to let them know that you need help, but you don't need help too much, because if you need too much help, then you might end up sectioned. You could end up in the mental health hospital, and you've got kids, and you definitely don't want to be there even if you didn't have the kids, and you need to be allowed to keep the kids as well. So you can't be too mentally unhealthy, but you definitely need help, and you're trying to get this balance right. Why did you want to tell your mental illness story?
Mostly because the mental illness stories, the way that they have been told, has been untruthful. There's not been a lot of space for someone who is living a whole life, whatever that looks like, with mental illness, and is allowed to articulate it in a way that is honest, that it contains the multitudes of what a life with mental illness looks like. And I feel lucky to be able to articulate it, to have the skills as a writer, to be able to put words down on a page. And so I felt that sharing my mental illness story was something that could actually be a helpful tool for other people who, maybe didn't have the words or didn't know them yet, or hadn't done the many decades of therapy that I had done, and that what I could add to the conversation could change the conversation to be more helpful.
As you've answered that question, you've reminded me of some research that I came across probably about 20 years ago now. A guy in the US, name is Corey Keyes, came up with this concept of flourishing, and he developed something called the mental health continuum. What he actually argues is that mental health and mental illness exist on 2 different planes. So you can actually be high in both or low in both. In other words, you can have mental illness as part of your life, but still actually experience flourishing. You can still experience well-being even though you're psychologically being decimated by your anxiety. And it sounds like that's kind of what you're describing.
Oh, I have a really excellent, lovely, fulfilling life in so many ways, and I have mental illness. Yes. And I'm not separate from mental illness. It affects me every single day, but it doesn't make my life horrible. And that was a really important thing that I wanted to convey in this book. There are so many things in my life that make it fulfilling and enriching and beautiful and happy. To be happy and depressed at the same time is something that I have wrestled with for most of my life.
And as you say that, Anna, I can imagine that anyone who is struggling with any kind of mental illness right now is saying, thank you for seeing me. Like, thank you for recognizing that I'm still a whole person. I can still celebrate my children. I can still look at the sunset and say, my goodness, that is stunning. And life is worth living, even though I wonder if it is. There's that wholeness. What do we need to know about your mental illness so that this conversation will make sense?
Well, I have had anxiety for my whole life, quite debilitating anxiety since I was a little kid. And part of what I learned in writing this book was just how long that had been hanging around. So when I was 19, I had 2 psychotic episodes, and that was very frightening. And I felt for a long time that was sort of where my mental illness began. But actually, when I reflected on it, and through the therapy that I've done, but also especially through writing this book, realized that it had been there for a lot longer than that, and in the generations before me as well. So I have been a depressed person too, have had clinical depression most of my life, but the anxiety is the main thing. I'm a frightened, nervous, hyper aware, sort of always worried about the worst case scenario type of a person, but also a very optimistic person, I think. I think in some ways those two things go together. I have a belief that things will work out in the end. It's completely unfounded, but that it sort of exists within that same spectrum of everything is terrible. It's the other side of that is like anything is possible. So I think they're part of the same sort of, double helix of anxiety maybe.
I want to talk to you more about the parenting aspect of when you've got that level of debilitating anxiety, how you raise kids. But we'll get to that shortly. First off, though, I've noticed over the last dozen or so years, maybe a fraction more than that, there's an increasing level of appetite for these conversations. And it didn't used to be a thing to talk about. Why the change?
When I started writing about mental illness, which was probably 10 years ago, I thought, I can't see my story anywhere. And I wanted to write, and I had to leave my job because I was so unwell. And that was then the thing that I wrote about. It was the only thing I was thinking about was how anxious I was. And so that was what I wrote. And there weren't conversations happening about it. And so I felt very, very isolated. It's like nobody else is having these kinds of experiences. I'm the only, which I knew couldn't be true. But when I looked for the evidence, there wasn't any. And I think there's been a huge push for people to share their own narratives in a way that's going to help other people. And at the same time, it has created safer places for people to be able to do that. It is safer now from all kinds of perspectives, financially safer, physically safer, emotionally safer, to share these sorts of stories now because people have done it. The normalization that has happened in sharing stories has changed what the mental health and mental illness conversation looks like tremendously. Part of that has been mental health organizations that have come out and actually used plain English to describe some of these illnesses and scenarios and symptoms outside of their clinical presentation, which has helped people to identify with them much better than they had been able to before. And then, the prevalence of these kinds of illnesses has been a factor in that too, that more and more people are experiencing or understanding that they are experiencing anxiety and depression in particular. And so they are looking for help. They're looking for community. They're looking for other people who understand what they're going through. And it has, I think, had a bit of a snowball effect. All of those things together, I'm not sure that it could have happened if any one of those things wasn't also happening. It feels like it's been a group effort to bring it into sort of the forefront of the conversation without demeaning it or diminishing it, or kind of, it hasn't been a negative thing in almost every way. It has become something that you can say to someone, oh, yeah, I'm feeling bad, or I'm feeling anxious, or it's making it difficult for me to do my job. And that the conversation has moved on from, that's weird, you're a freak, which is what it was like 15 years ago.
Yeah, interesting. You talk like you really, really know psychology and public health. Do you have qualifications in that now as you've gone through this mental illness journey, for want of a better word?
No, I am just on the tail end of doing a PhD, but it's in creative writing about psychology. So it's not a psychology PhD. But when you are as unwell as I have been, and this is true of all kinds of chronic illnesses, that you have to learn how to advocate for yourself, partly because and I would speak to the mental health industry specifically, it doesn't understand how to help people well enough for you to be able to rely on a doctor or a nurse or a triage service or whoever's trying to help you to actually understand even what you're asking for. And that was something that I learned through doing, that I would go to a doctor and I would say, hey, I feel really bad. And they would say, could you explain more what you mean? And I couldn't. And there wasn't language, and I didn't have the clinical language, and they didn't understand what I was trying to say to them, and they couldn't kind of match it up to the clinical diagnostic criteria they had. And so I had to keep looking and kind of hunting and trying out different kinds of language to help them understand how they could help me. And I guess in the process of doing that, learned a lot about why my brain was doing the things that it was, what it meant, when I should be worried, what was an emergency, all these different things that they couldn't tell me. And so my choices were invest the energy in learning and being a better self-advocate, or kind of put yourself in harm's way. And so I do feel that I didn't have any choice but to do that. And I think it has helped me to be able to share experiences, symptoms, different aspects of mental illness, life with mental illness that can help others too. And part of that is to be able to help my children. But my thoughts around self-advocacy, a lot of them are our language that we use as people who have mental illness to describe that experience is more helpful than the clinical language that the medical system has, that is currently demonstrably failing people terribly.
Get curious, not furious. Be where your feet are. Mistakes lead to mastery. High emotions, low intelligence. Have you ever heard these or any of the other principles I share and thought, I need to stick that on my wall? Well, now you can. The Happy Families team has pulled out the best Justinisms for A5 mini posters. Perfect for your home or even the classroom, and easy to grab at happyfamilies.com.au. Anna Spargo-Ryan is the author of A Kind of Magic, a memoir about anxiety, our minds and optimism in spite of it all. The memoir comes out today. It launches today. Anna, how many kids have you got?
2.
We need to talk about parenting when you have a mental illness.
Yes.
About your kids, you said, and I quote, I lamented my inability to take them to the museum, to the zoo, on an interstate holiday. I felt these were the markers of good parenting. How could I call myself a mother if I couldn't take them to a nearby play centre without having a panic attack in the car park? And then you went on and quoted yourself from an ABC article that you'd written. You said, soon they will be teenagers. Their friends will ask them why I'm always a no-show, and my children will say that I'm too afraid. They probably won't hate me, but they might be embarrassed by me. Maybe they will think about all the times I let them down when they were children, all the times we sat in the car on the side of the road waiting for the adrenaline to wear off, all the times every part of me was shouting, yes, I want to do these things with you, and I still said no. My question for you, based on what you've written on that page, which gives me chills in the way that you've described that deep desire to do everything you can for the kids and the inability to actually do it. What does it mean to be a good parent when you struggle with mental illness?
For me, it has meant having an open line of communication, creating a supportive environment in which to say how you're feeling. So the thing I realized about living with such debilitating anxiety was that what was, I guess, scary about it, or that made me feel like a bad parent about it, was that it was what I remembered from growing up in a household with anxious parents, which was that I always thought they were in danger. And I always then thought as a consequence that I was in danger. And I couldn't, as a child, differentiate between just anxiety and an actual danger. And so when I thought about what I could do, what I could actually feasibly do as a parent who was too scared to go to the museum, but who also had panic attacks in front of her children, the most valuable thing I could do for them was to try to articulate what was actually going on, which was my brain believes that I'm in danger right now, but it's not true. It's that my brain is lying. You're safe. I'm safe. I just am having a bit of a thing where my brain thinks that I'm not. It will pass and everything will be okay. And that was something that my anxious parents either couldn't articulate to me, or because it was the 80s, like didn't know that they should, or that it would have been helpful. But that through the therapeutic work that I've done and through raising children as an anxious parent, raising anxious children, that having that clarity around what it actually means and what is actually going on has changed our whole relationship. So to be able to say to them, hey, this is happening again and you don't need to worry. Now I think they actually don't worry. They have learned to identify, where I never did, the difference between a real danger and a perceived danger. And, you know, I couldn't take them to the museum. But what I have been able to give them is kind of tools for managing their own feelings, which actually I think is an incredibly valuable thing.
Yeah. And I reckon we could unpack that for the next hour or so, but our time is really running short. And there's one more thing that I want to ask you if you're comfortable with it, and that's talking about the intergenerational transfer of mental illness. So you had a mum with major mental illness. You had grandparents who had significant mental illness, including was it a grandfather who died by suicide?
Yes, my paternal grandfather.
And you've just shared that your kids also have some mental illness challenges. How do we break the cycle? How do we help to parent ourselves in such a way that we don't pass too much of it onto our kids? And then if we do, how do we make sure that we don't beat ourselves up for it and hold ourselves completely responsible for the challenges that our children are experiencing in this domain?
I think one of the things to think about is what we mean when we say, like, how not to pass it on, or how do we make sure that we don't contribute to their mental illness? Because a lot of the challenge with mental illness and getting the right help and all of these things that we deal with on a daily basis now is that it is still perceived as something that you should be ashamed of, that is a fault, that is a problem, when actually a lot of the issues around mental illness are societal. You know, we don't provide enough support. We saw during COVID that when people had what they needed, their mental illness issues were much more alleviated. You know, that someone who had housing, who had food, who had money to pay their bills was mentally healthier than they were without that. And so is the issue that we need to avoid passing these things on, or is it that we need to create better structures to support people who have these sorts of challenges? I mean, both of my children and I are also neurodiverse, and that has been an interesting thing to think about in terms of, well, I mean, that's just a way that a brain behaves. It's not a problem unless society makes it a problem. And so from my perspective, I think having open lines of conversation, as I said, being able to communicate these ideas, being able to help the people who do that work to write good policy, to incorporate good, helpful language, to therefore, as a result of that, help someone to understand why the funding is so important, how to, for example, produce good campaigns as a mental health organisation. What do people actually need? What is actually going to help? It's all of those kinds of things. And we know that some mental illness has a genetic predisposition. So, for example, anxiety is about 30% hereditary, something like generalized anxiety disorder. And so at one level, there's an inevitability to anxiety. So if you know that you're a very anxious person with an anxious parent who had an anxious parent and now you have an anxious child, there's not a lot you probably could have done about that. But what you can do something about is to help that person to be part of a functioning society that is going to support and understand them. And that's where I come at it from, I think. I don't want to teach my child not to be anxious exactly. I want them to be able to get good support so that they can learn to manage it and so that it doesn't have an overwhelmingly detrimental impact on their life, but I don't want them to feel like it makes them less. I want them to live in a society that supports them anyway and that loves them anyway. And I mean, I think it's summed up in the dedication of my book, which I thought about a lot, and I landed on: for better mental health care, universal access, compassion, action, and love. And those are the things that I think are going to make the biggest difference to that intergenerational anxiety / other mental illness question.
And I think that your conversation with me today will I hope that it makes a difference as well. The book comes out today. It's called A Kind of Magic. Anna Spargo-Ryan is the author. Thanks so much for chatting with me.
Thank you so much for having me, Justin.
The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. And for more information about making your family happier, please visit us at happyfamilies.com.au. I'm going to mention, in addition to Anna's book, which we will link to in the show notes, next week on Wednesday, on the 12th of October, we've got a free webinar called Burnt Out for any parent who is feeling like they're completely over it and need some help, need some structure, need anything. Free webinar, Burnt Out, on the 12th of October. All the details are at our Facebook page, Dr. Justin Coulson's Happy Families.